Hmm. Have you?
Oh, you're asking now?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm not terribly engaged with most of the kind of day-to-day secular struggles of things like getting them, God under God out off the currency or crushes out of public spaces and things like that. I think that many of those kinds of expressions of civic religiosity are not terribly consequential, but I'm more concerned about the corrosive effect that allowing tax-free churches to have a political role in society, causes, because they're such, at least in the United States, they're one of the most powerful political organizations around, and they're not supposed to tell people how to vote from the pulpit. I think it's dangerous when you enact too many restrictions on political speech of religious institutions, but if they actively, organize voter drives and so forth, I think they should have their tax-free status taken away. So that's an issue in the United States. I don't know how transportable that issue is to Australia, but
I think we're even less. Well, the Constitution's even less of a secular nature than America, but yeah, I think I'm not sure how it actually plays out practically in Australia. I think there is quite a lot of sway in Australia, but I don't think the religiosity is as deep as, well, the voters are as religious as they are in America, in some parts of America anyway. That's the
mhm.
general impression I get, yeah. But I mean, like, it seems that so there's a lot of attempts to cut off the heads of the Hydra, so to speak, in attempts to like get rid of religion out of politics. But I'm not sure if they're looking at the real core issues of what's actually driving the want or the need for these sorts of religions having power, or any sort of dogmatic uh, ideology forcing its way into politics, and organising large lobby groups and having sort of benefits that are afforded them. So what do you think are the main core issues with
Well,
yeah.
you seem to be referring to the notion that religion plays a function, which, as a social scientist,
Well,
and someone
historically.
who's drunk deeply from evolutionary psychology, I have to believe that something as ubiquitous as religion has some important function in human psychology and culture and social structure. And that was, in fact, the focus of my bachelor's thesis. I did a bachelor's thesis on Pentecostal speaking in tongues, and it was a functionalist thesis that society needs institutions that bind individuals to unquestioned absolutes. Otherwise, radical individualism would tear social fabric apart. I think I continue to struggle with that thesis because I don't think that you need all the all extant forms of religiosity. I think you could have new forms of uh, social solidarity and awe and all the other things that religion provides, mystery, that would perform the same psychological and social function without all the ignorance and homophobia and patriarchy and so forth. So I was raised a Unitarian Universalist. It's a distinctively, about Unitarian Universalism. It's a distinctively humanistic approach, post Enlightenment approach to trying to figure out what you can reclaim from the religious traditions after you throw out all the superstition. And I considered becoming a Unitarian minister, and I'm teaching a seminar now at the local Unitarian church. So Unitarianism is basically an attempt to see if you can provide all the things that religion is supposed to provide without all the bullshit.
What are the things that you think religion should provide, and that has historically provided, which may have worked in the past, but you think maybe doesn't work today?
Well, an education and exposure to the corpus of human wisdom traditions, some of which aren't so wise, but at least an effort to sift through the stories and myths and teachings of the different religions to see what kinds of commonalities they might hold and insights they might provide. And that's certainly the reason I took my family back to the Unitarian Church so that my kids would have the same exposure to religious education that I had as a kid. I was first exposed to Buddhism as a Unitarian kid. And then a sense of community. I think one of the reasons why people who are religious are happier in every society, although secular societies are happier than religious societies, which is one of the ironies, but inside of societies, religious people are happier than secular people. One of the reasons is that they have this solidarity with a community that can provide them support. If they fall and need, if they need help at the hospital, if their loved one dies, there's somebody to call on, some rituals to call on, and a sense of broader purpose and meaning. I think one of the things that secular society doesn't provide very well. That one of the reasons why the Marxist movement was a kind of quasi-religion for workers, and then once Marxism and the socialist movement collapsed, and fascism collapsed, then you didn't have secular alternatives to religion to provide those senses of absolute meaning and purpose. I don't know that Unitarianism provides that very well. It provides the community part, it provides the exposure to the teachings, but because Unitarianism is a post-enlightenment tradition and a humanist tradition, it doesn't tell people what to believe, and therefore it's not very good at providing, those answers about why you have to get out of bed in the morning and believe everything makes a difference. But I think they're trying to figure that out.
Mm, mm. Have you got any educated guesses where you think they might end up in the next 20 to 30 years, or whoever finds out what the real motivators should be for getting people out of bed in the morning?
Well, I'm not sure if it'll be Unitarianism. I mean, I think Unitarianism will always be a kind of a niche flavor of things. I think what's really happening is that religions in general are groping towards modernity in their own ways. Some of them, by lurching backwards 3 steps and then another step forward. We'll see what happens with this new Pope and the Catholics. But one of the things that religions will increasingly have to take into account are our growing understanding of the brain and how faith and spiritual experience actually work. And I think one of the things I've been speculating about in recent years is the trans spirituality, the incorporation of neurotechnologies and neuroscience understanding into spirituality, because people, and eventually they'll be able to take a pill and achieve more than saints and monks have been able to achieve in the past with years and years of effort. And that's going to change. It's going to turn everything on its head. So
That's interesting. I mean, I was reading Citizen Cyborg, and one of the quotes you put in there was by Richard Dawkins. It spoke about something about we've been at the mercy of our genes, and also the memes or the social norms or the culture that we're born into. So addressing the genes, you could imagine us, I guess, providing some form of brain-computer interfaces to intervene at the action potential level, what the genes would have us do, and help us be more moral or have more bliss or have more insight with the use of the technology that we're developing, or some form of AI connecting to our brains, jacking in somehow. But then there's also the memes or the culture that we're in at the moment, and I
mhm.
think that's what the the secular movement is uh, trying to, oh, I won't say attack, but like change. Yeah. So it's interesting. Okay, well, what kind of technologies do you think we will be using to help us overcome some of the the evolutionary closures or hang-ups that we've had in the past, and how will that be surprising to religions?
Well, this seminar that I'm teaching at the local church right now is called Liberal Neurotheology, and the focus of what I'm introducing them to, the ideas I'm introducing them to, is that it's kind of an argument with John Haidt, who is a very popular evolutionary psychologist right now. He is one of the pioneers of positive psychology, of the kind of investigation about how we can be happier. And he's got this new book out called The Righteous Mind that it makes what I consider to be an unfortunately naturalistic fallacy argument. In other words, he's identified that there are certain moral intuitions that people have, some of which are stronger among conservatives. And he faults liberals for not taking more seriously the moral intuitions that conservatives have about things like hierarchy, in-group solidarity, and the importance of sacredness and purity. So the way that this works is that when people get upset about interracial marriage or gay marriage, the parts of their brain are lighting up that are activating these moral intuitions that people have about that's not sacred and somehow impure. Or when people say that you should, screw the police, liberals think that's okay, or radicals think that's okay, and conservatives don't, because it lights up the part of the brain, or not, about respect for authority. So Haidt thinks that society can't function unless we have these kinds of respect for authority, in-group solidarity, and respect for sacred symbols. He may be right. And this gets back to this Unitarian question. Can you have liberal versions of these things? So that's one question. But on the other hand, there's substantial evidence that that distinguishes liberals and conservatives is that liberals have larger anterior cingulate cortexes, and conservatives have larger and more active amygdalas. In other words, conservatives have bigger parts and more active parts of the brain that are sensitive to fear and disgust, and liberals tend to have bigger parts of the brain that are involved in rational decision making. And what happens is that depending on which part of your brain is more dominant, if you see a Muslim walking down the street and his wife has a shawl on, we may both have that part of our brain go off. Oh, that's different and weird, and maybe I should be afraid because of some difference in my neighborhood. But the liberals' front part of the brain tells the back part of the brain to shut up, and the conservatives' back part of the brain tells the front part of the brain, be afraid. So, to me, that does not mean that liberals should respect more the back part of the brain. It means that, in fact, what the Enlightenment has been is a victory of reason over fear and ignorance. And what Haidt's naturalistic fallacy is basically a capitulation to this incredible victory that the Enlightenment values have had. And since you've been reading Citizen Cyborg, you know that I see transhumanism as being a direct outgrowth of Enlightenment thought. And so I consider the celebration of liberal values and our capacity for rationality to overwhelm fear and disgust and ignorance to be the victory of those values. I think, so back in answer to your question, the kinds of technologies I look forward to are not simply technologies which excite or enhance all of our moral intuitions. They would be technologies which would allow us to suppress some moral intuitions because they're not good moral intuitions, enhance others. So there are other moral intuitions we have about fairness and about caring for others. Although the fairness one is even complicated, because fairness, the moral intuitions that we have about fairness are actually to punish cheating. Because within monkey troops, it's basically the monkey who's cheating that you want to whack over the head. And that can be quite reactionary if we think that if we're told by conservatives that the cheaters in our society are the freeloading welfare cheats, or the people in the dole, as opposed to the bankers and the capitalists and the people in the gated communities. So our moral intuitions are not a sufficient guide, and of course no religious or philosophical tradition ever has said that. What they have to be balanced by is not only our capacity to pick and choose among which moral intuitions we have and which are legitimate, but to have the rational capacities to pick and choose. So another part of what allows us to have more moral capacity is cognitive enhancement, the ability to think more clearly, to have more insight into our own feelings and thinking, thought processes. So stimulant medications, cognitive enhancement avenues in general also have. It's not that being smarter makes you more wise necessarily. It's more to it than that. But being smarter is a component. It's one of the things that contributes to an overall package of character development, which allows us to become better people.
What do you think? What could likely go wrong with some of the experiments that we're going to make with, I guess, moral patchings or introducing moral patches to our framework?
Well, I think one of the problems is that some people will find it very useful to turn off moral intuitions in order to be more effective in certain kinds of jobs or situations in life. If you want to go out and get laid in the evening, being the most Machiavellian masher you could possibly be might be the most effective way to do that. And so you might want to turn off your shyness, turn off your sensitivity, the sensitive male side of your personality, and just turn on the wolf. And similarly, if you were going to work and you work in a very capitalist, cutthroat environment, you might want to just turn off everything except for your capacity to make a buck. And I think that could have negative consequences for the way that we behave. It's even more dramatic in a military setting, although I think people probably overemphasize that the effect of moral and cognitive modification in the military setting, because in fact, it's not terribly effective to be an amoral soldier. You have to care about at least the people that you're working with, and also you have to be able to obey the rules of law so that you don't experience massive blowback by killing the wrong people on the field. So I think that at any rate, we might want to be very careful about people suppressing moral capacities for one reason or another.
Julian Savulescu, I'm going to be interviewing him soon, and he's written a book, Unfit for the Future, which I haven't actually read yet, but I've read about it and I've read some of his work. He's a proponent that we should really be focusing on making ourselves moral enough and smart enough and able enough to be able to deal with the more complex problems we're facing today, and the different types of problems that we're facing today compared to the type of problems we had to solve during most of the period of our evolution.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I think that's going to be an interesting one. Have you read any of his work? I think you quote him.
Yeah, well, Julian's one of the leading thinkers about moral enhancement, and we're going to be actually meeting up in Belgrade in about 6 weeks to talk about avenues of moral enhancement. I think that his book is an interesting first step. He's a provocateur, and so his arguments are so over the top that most people, even in philosophy, really don't take seriously what he's been saying. I mean, one of the things that he and his collaborators have said is that the technologies of the future are going to be so dangerous that we have to have mandatory universal moral enhancement. Now, I think that really rubs liberals in an incredibly bad way. The notion that everyone's going to have their brain shunted in order to make sure that we don't become terrorists. But I think, stepping back from the universality of his argument, we do need to ensure that we suppress the kinds of psychopathy that leads to mass murder. Now, in the United States, we recently had, just 50 miles from where I am, we had a gunman walk into an elementary school and kill 27 people, 21 kids and 6 adults, something like that. And he was a young man, and he had a lot of automatic weapons, and it immediately led to a debate which has been simmering for a long time in the United States because of all the mass murders in schools, mass murders in public places in the United States with guns, about how much blame to put on the guns and how much blame to put on psychopathy or mental illness, and then what to do about the mental illness. So one of the things the right has proposed in the United States is that we have a universal register of all people who have been diagnosed as having dangerous amounts of mental illness, and that the federal government should be notified about them, and that they shouldn't be able to buy guns. On the face of it, that makes sense to a lot of people. There's a lot of support for that. But there's a huge civil liberties issue. So Julian makes this argument in the abstract. We're dealing with the reality of it right now. The reality of trying to say that there needs to be universal mandatory treatment for psychopathy is that every person now with a mental diagnosis in the United States is worried that their name's going to go on a registry with the federal government. Not only that they shouldn't be allowed to have guns, but all kinds of consequences might flow from that. So I think we are entering, and have always been in, but are entering increasingly turbulent and difficult issues about negotiating between individual freedom, cognitive freedom, and the potential of very effective neurotechnological treatments for deviant cognition.
Well, back to secularism. Do you think secularism plays a role in trying to achieve a better way of dealing with some of the massive issues that we're facing today, with regard to, stopping psychopaths shooting people in schools, or stopping corporations from doing the wrong thing, or just like turning off their morality circuits so as to chase more dollars?
Do I think that secularism provides any answers? No, I don't think that secularism in and of itself is a moral stance, a political stance, a coherent stance on anything. What secularism is a statement that it's a negative statement. It's a statement that we need to have a society that is, and a state that is neutral towards expressions of religious ultimate ends and moral codes and so forth. Now, the state has to have some moral compass. Public policy has to have some moral compass. And one of the arguments of liberal democracy is that there are some minimal moral agreements that are shared universally among religions, not to kill, not to torture, things like that. Unfortunately, they're not, in fact, universals, but almost universals. And that those, but adopting those is not, in fact, a religious or anti-religious stance. I think that's been problematic because there are, in fact, religions that hold the contrary views, to everything. Like, in Egypt now, in the Arab Spring, there are plenty of actors who say we are not Democrats. We are jihadis. We want to establish a caliphate. We want to establish a Sharia law. We don't believe in liberal democracy, and we don't believe in secularism. And so there are plenty of actors who don't agree with what liberal Democrats think should be the minimum agreement among people in this society. At any rate, I think to say that secularism somehow would be better guide to public policy doesn't really make sense to me. What it is that it should be the minimum agreement of how we live together in a liberal modern society. And then we need to have an argument about what kind of policies to have.
Yeah, so I probably didn't phrase the question very well. I agree with you. It's not really a moral code. It's a requirement for a more, I guess, objective moral code to be instilled into the state. So, in other words, you believe that if religion has too much control at the state level, it's less likely that a more objective moral code, maybe that born of the Enlightenment, would be able to take hold.
Well, yeah, they're pretty much mutually exclusive, unless there are more enlightenment flavored religiosities. I think that, one of the nice things about Anglicanism today, Episcopalianism, and some of the other modern liberal Protestant sects is that they have sufficiently drunk from the Enlightenment chalice that they don't really pose a threat to democracy in the way that they might have in Puritan days or something. But unfortunately, when you drink from the Enlightenment chalice, it's poisonous for religion because it's corrosive. It burns all the way down, and they are dying as sects. So the ones that are making the most valiant effort to survive are the fundamentalists, because they're trying to circle their ideological wagons and have ideological closure against the Enlightenment. And that's why, these conservative popes are perfectly understandable. Vatican II was the opening the door to chaos ideologically. But eventually, that path of ideological closure doesn't work either. And I think that, they're shrinking as well.
Okay, that's interesting. So do you think it would be okay to have like an Anglican flavor of government?
Well, I think Christian democracy in Europe is an example of a reasonably democracy-friendly form of Christian conservatism. I mean, Christian Democrats in Europe would be considered liberals in the United States. The things that they take for granted about the welfare state, even gay marriage at this point, would be considered anathema among most Christian conservatives in the United States. So I think, one of the ironies of European Christianity is that because it has been such a state-focused religiosity, it has precisely led to the secularization of Europe. The Swedish, my favorite anecdote about the Swedish church, the Lutherans, I guess, or the Swedish church, is that you actually have democratic elections in local areas to determine who controls the local churches. And the Social Democratic Party has to have its equal number of people on the church boards, even though they are often not religious or atheist people. So the Swedish church is actually democratically elected, controlled by atheists. So it's not really the same phenomenon as the United States, where 90% of people say they believe in God still, and 60% of people say that they're Christians, and a lot of people still go to church, and we have a bazillion churches, and it's not the same as having your state sanctioned church that it collects its dues through taxation, like in Italy and Germany, places like that.
Interesting. So you mentioned before that they've already drunk from the chalice of enlightenment, and slowly but surely these churches seem to be converting into convert their values into enlightenment values. But do you think it'll actually convert everything? Do you think they'll give up the dogma that there is a particular mysteriousness in the universe, that God factor, or that thing beyond the threshold of observation?
Well, if you look back at the history of Enlightenment thought, there was most of the original Enlightenment thinkers were religious in some form or another, and they were attempting to synthesize their beliefs in rationality, science, empiricism with their religiosity, trying to figure out how God's plan could be discerned in the world. So there are ways, I don't follow these ways, I don't believe in them, but there are ways that people have attempted religiously to square that circle. And I think there is sufficient amount of mystery in the universe that if you open your compass wide enough, if you don't get too hung up on the biblical literalism or God having created the universe in a particular time and place, in a particular way, that you could, adopt the Catholic position, which is that, God's the prima causa. Bring on any science you want. God started the ball rolling at some point. Disprove it, and it's impossible to disprove. So.
Sure. Yeah. So, do you want to discuss how your Buddhist leanings have affected your views on how the state should be organized? Perhaps in reference to secularism, if that's relevant, but if not, just general um, state organization.
Well, when I went to college back in 1979, I had just read Marxist interpretation of early Buddhism. It's a book called The Buddha by a scholar called Trevor Ling, and it's still a landmark book, but he did this interpretation of original Buddhism that put it in the context of the erosion of the relatively democratic and republican tribal regions of India being dominated by growing monarchies in the time that the Buddha arose. And the Buddha's religious order being constituted to be explicitly the reconstitution of a democratic order that would turn in Buddhism we talk about turning the wheel of the Dharma, turn the wheel of the Dharma against the wheel of akusala, or the wheel of unrighteousness. And the stories that are in the Buddhist tradition about how society arises and how state power first comes to be are very much root that story in the emergence of property and corruption and greed, and that the only reason that we need state power is to protect property. So if we were able to overcome our greed, if we were able to turn the wheel of the Dharma so that people lived more righteous lives, we would have a more Taoist approach to governance. And so the idea was that if you could establish the dominance of righteousness over governance, in other words, the dominance of the religious order, the Buddhist order over the king, then you could have a Dhamma Raja, a king who was righteous. So, I mean, this is a common idea, the notion that the king has to be righteous, the notion that the Holy Emperor of Europe has to be under the thumb of the Pope and so forth. And it's certainly a useful idea for imperialism because many Buddhist kings, then Ashoka and Chinese kings and Japanese kings and others, used it as a legitimacy for their rule. But I think that the basic logic still works, which is that it's the same logic as Marxist-Leninism, which is that there should be a party governed by a righteous ideology, controlled by the people, governed by an internal process of participatory democracy that establishes the control over the state and keeps it pure from corrupting influences like capitalism. And so this is a very common idea. It's the idea of theocracies. It's the idea of other institutions. I think what's interesting and novel about liberal democracy, and what's so complicated about the Enlightenment, is that we have explicitly introduced into the Enlightenment the notion that our utopia has to be one in which there is disputation and in which there's a constant ecology of ideas and not just one dominant idea. And if you look back again at Buddhism, Buddhism never had a pope. It didn't legitimate the idea of a central religious authority. And in fact, when there were religious disputes among Buddhist monks, the process was just that Buddhist monks would go and form another community who believed in a particular doctrine or sect or something. If we had followed that, instead of having dominant religious orders, which as soon as a king becomes a Buddhist, he wants to have the Buddhist monks who agree with him and who are under his thumb be the dominant religious order, and he would stamp out all the other Buddhist monks. So the coevolution of state power and monastic rule, went on and on. But I think there was an original kind of anarchistic idea in Buddhism that is more compatible with a liberal democratic pluralism of possibility. But those were ideas that I was more engaged with when I was a monk and in Sri Lanka. I haven't really attempted to be an exegete of Buddhist political philosophy for quite a long time, principally because who the hell cares, you know? even in Sri Lanka and Burma and Thailand and places like that, they don't really care whether it's a Buddhist political philosophy or not. And you know, the example that I loved was there used to be an organization based in Mongolia called Buddhists for Peace. And it was run by the Soviets, the Russians, and all the communist Buddhist monks from communist and non-communist countries, Vietnam and Laos and places like that, they would go to these conferences in Ulaanbaatar, and they would say, you know, the Buddha was for peace, therefore he was opposed to American imperialism, and therefore America should get out of, you know, X, Y, and Z countries. It's like, okay, you know, that exegesis works just as well as any other, I suppose, you know.
Yeah, that's funny. So, well, in terms of like achieving the goals of secularism today, what do you think the movement should be? Well, how do we think, if you agree with it, if you agree that, you know, in order to, well, I think you do, if you agree that in order to have an effective government, we need some agnostic moral stance and objective moral stance, then we need to do something. How do you think we should be achieving the idea, the purpose of the secular movement? How do you think about it?
I don't really identify as a secular activist. I mean, I do identify as someone who's a militant opponent of the religious right. And I'm an opponent of them, not only in their Christian form, but in their Muslim form and in their Buddhist form and in their Hindu form. There's, you know, their religious rights all over the world. In their Orthodox Russian form, which is a particularly scary form. Probably in their neo-Maoist form too, which has yet to fully manifest. But at any rate, you know, I am an opponent of those because they legitimate authoritarianism, patriarchy, homophobia, a lot of the social ills and sins that I am opposed to. I don't think that secularism, as we've just discussed, I don't think provides any answers. So I don't. It's not that I'm an atheist activist. It's that I'm an advocate for values and political ideas that I think provide better alternatives for, you know, human flourishing than the religious right provides. I think that there are certain ideas about human freedom that they're opposed to that are intrinsically associated with secular side of society, and that those are better for human flourishing and certain kinds of equality. But, you know, as a sociologist, I have to also be clear that there have been plenty of progressive movements have arisen out of and used religious resources in order to motivate themselves. So in the United States, civil rights movement, the abolitionist movement, were, you know, very much religious movements and combined with religious ideas. So, you know, I don't think that it's very clear. You know, if I was in Burma, you know, Aung San Suu Kyi is obviously the progressive force for reform in Burma. And it wouldn't make any sense to go to Burma and say, okay, we have to tell all these Buddhist monks to go jump on a lake because we're secularists, you know, and we're going to be fighting for atheism and secular reason in Burma. No, in fact, the Buddhist monks are the good guys in this particular fight. Sometimes they're the bad guys because sometimes they go on pogroms against Muslims, so we have to be clear about that. But in general, in this particular fight, they're the good guys. So, you know, we just have to pick and choose which particular fights we want to do.
Okay, that's interesting. So, I mean, like, you don't think it's necessary to have a state which is has no component of any religiosity in it for it to be effective. So, in other words, there could exist a state that has religiosity in it that would be acceptably effective in modern times and moving forward.
Well, I don't think you can. Let's take Britain as an example. Excuse me. I don't think that by law the British monarch can be anything but an Anglican. Okay. I'm not a fan of the British monarchy. I would be perfectly happy if it were to be abolished. But one of the arguments for why Sweden and Northern European countries in general that still have monarchies, and England, have been as stable as democracies as they have been. The reconstitution of democracy in Spain, for instance, was that they had monarchies that provided some symbolic legitimacy to liberal democracy. And one of the arguments in the United States is, why have we had this imperial presidency? Why do we have all these imperial trappings around our presidency? And it's because there may be, in fact, psychological utility and cultural utility in having a strong monarchical figure at the head of state. And perhaps it's better that it be a purely symbolic one, like the Queen, rather than actually being someone who has their finger on the nuclear button. Now, is it problematic that the Queen has to be an Anglican and can't be a Muslim? Does it make any difference at all? I don't think it makes any difference at all. I mean, England could become 99% Muslim, and the Queen could still be an Anglican, and it wouldn't make any difference at all, right? Or they could become 100% atheist, and it wouldn't make any difference at all. They could have gay marriage and people hanging out of windows having sex, and it wouldn't make any difference at all that the Queen was an Anglican. So, yeah, I think that there are ways in which religion can be institutionalized in the state that is absolutely inconsequential.
Okay, interesting. But which ways in which religion could be constitutionalized into the state do you think are dangerous? So we're clear.
Well, yeah, I think the reason that we've had a 300-year and ongoing struggle to create a more secular state, and in which a struggle that I still consider myself a partisan and very much engaged in, is because most religious forces are attempting to make sure that only their version of religiosity and only their expressions of the good and of human flourishing are institutionalized in the state. So, for instance, that gay people shouldn't be allowed to marry because that's somehow going to cause the cultural and civil erosion of the institution of marriage, which is nonsense. So I think that there are ways in which you start from liberal secular principles and you say, should people in general be able to make contracts with one another about how they live together? Yes. Why would one be preferred over the other just because they happen to have some religious legitimation? They shouldn't, and therefore who's in the way of us creating a more rational society? The religious right. And so we have to get them out of the way. Yes, I mean, that fight has to be done. But does it really change anything to have the phrase, in God we trust, on the American dollar bill? No. Does it really change anything to have a moment of silence in our public schools? No, this is one of the fights that we've had in the United States. I think there's a problem if a teacher gets up and says, now everybody bow your head and think about Jesus. Yeah, that's a problem. But if a teacher got up every morning and said, let's all take a moment of silence today and you can pray or not, I really don't care. So I think there are ways that religiosity can be a part of the civil institutions of society and the state, which are inconsequential, and other ways in which it's very problematic.
Okay, so you've been referring to religiosity for both the dogmatic kind and also the sort of the spirituality, like moment of silence in school. So do you want to unpack what you mean when you say religiosity in that context? Like, what's the difference between religiosity, which demands that you chop the end of all the male children's penises off, or the sort of religiosity which inspires people to meditate over whatever, without any specific dogmatic idea of what God is and what he or she or it or the non-existence wants us to do behind closed doors?
Well, it's you kind of know when you see it, but there is some interesting research related to the psychology of it. There's a model of personality called the five-factor personality model, ocean model: openness, conscientiousness, agreeableness, neuroticism. I'm forgetting what E is. And one of the things that they found in the personality literature is that conscientiousness is more common, is higher among people who are attracted to fundamentalism, right? Or perhaps it's the reverse, that people who are born conscientious are more attracted to fundamentalism. And people who have greater openness to novel experience tend to be more attracted to spiritual experiences, experiences of awe, natural, having an awe experience in nature and meditation. They're more likely to be hypnotized, things like that. So, and this has been a part of the kind of growing polarization in the United States. A lot of people who have disaffiliated from religious institutions say, I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious. And I think that's probably a descriptor for me as well. I have a strong sense of, I meditate, I have a strong sense of awe about the nature of the universe and about human existence, but I don't identify with any religious dogmas, including Buddhism. And so when you apply that to the state, I think one of the things that's been interesting to me is that insofar as the state tries to institutionalize particular dogmatic beliefs, to stamp out heresy or to heretical views of marriage or heretical views on sexuality or something like that, that's more of the conscientiousness fundamentalism end of things. And to the degree that it celebrates the numinous and our capacities for awe, establishes more public parks or something like that, I don't think we have a problem with that, right? I mean, so, if there were more moments of silence at public events as opposed to public prayer, which I do have a problem with, I wouldn't have a problem with that.
Excellent. Yeah. So, all right, to conclude, well, what do you think the state of play is today? I'm trying to think of a good concluding question. What are your, to wrap up, are there any other points about secularism that you want to discuss, or that you want to just point out?
No, I think I've said my piece on secularism.
Yes, you have. Yeah, that was really good.
Yeah, it's kind of a negative non-starter for me. I prefer to talk about all the reasons why the religious right is wrong, rather than all the reasons why secularism is right.
Sure. Okay. Awesome. Well, yeah. I'll put that up as a separate interview.